Hello BookTube, and welcome back to your Daily Penguin. This is our tour through that Penguin Classic wall behind me, book by book and author by author. And we've encountered series and time periods and books of minor interest, books of no literary interest, and every once in a while we encounter a towering modern classic. We saw it with Black Lamb and Grey Falcon, and we have one again today. Another towering nonfiction classic of the 20th century. This is Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem. The famous subtitle is A Report on the Banality of Evil, and this was done originally as a series of New Yorker articles back in 1966 by Hannah Arendt, who went to the trial of Adolf Eichmann, expecting moral outrage, I believe, expecting moral affront. I think that, like a lot of people, she went to that trial and sat in the observers section and watched the defendant's chair behind its bulletproof glass and expected that what would come into that cubicle would be a form of sulfuric evil. And I think she was affronted by what she saw instead, which was a fumbling, mumbling, mid-level bureaucrat who had nevertheless been personally responsible for the death of millions of people. I think that affronted her. I think that accounts for the sense of exquisitely controlled anger, rage that runs throughout this book. And I believe, this is a report of the trial, but Hannah Arendt then later made it into a book, and the original book and the original articles had some whoppers, had some misstatements, had some things that she herself immediately wanted to disown. When she revised the book, even by then, it had already been a flashpoint of controversy in the intellectual world of New York and London, as well as anywhere else, but in the bookish world mainly. There are people today who are still bitter about this book, often bitter about points that either the book never made or points that the author herself expunged in those earliest revisions, which was a maddening thing, especially for Hannah Arendt's most outspoken defenders, the most outspoken of which was Mary McCarthy, who was in awe of the book from the beginning, and who was, according to Hannah Arendt, the only person to really understand what was going on in that original book. This book has had many students ever since then. Obviously, the fact that it's a Penguin Classic means that it is distributed and studied in school, as well it should be. This author should be much better known. And known not only for this, her most famous book. She wrote lots of other things too that are all brilliant. But who knows what kinds of things are said in those classrooms where this is studied, if they mirror in any way that controversy that originally erupted around this work, with people outraged because they thought Hannah Arendt was blaming so-and-so or exonerating so-and-so or whatnot. I think that outrage and all of those arguments were sparked ultimately by that sense of rage. Hannah Arendt refers to it as euphoria, but what she means is a transport of anger outside of herself. I believe this is a very personal book. In other words, it's a report. It was done with all the trappings of the kind of long-form journalism that the New Yorker used to subsidize and love to print. Think Hiroshima, but lots of other things too. It was done with all of those trappings, but it isn't much like them in its emotional components. Its emotional components are overwhelming. At the affront that Hannah Arendt encountered when she saw how much evil could be drawn out of such humdrum sources, that infuriated her and outraged her. And when you read the book, you feel the fury and the outrage. And I think a lot of critics, especially somnolent, extremely established male critics, felt all of that and realized it was working on them on some readerly level. They were feeling that euphoria of outrage and didn't like it. Unfortunately, in my chosen profession, quite a few encrusted old reviewers don't want to feel that anymore. They don't want to feel that euphoria, that transport anymore. It's unsettling. They want to skim the introduction, skim the first 30 pages, and then wind off on largely pre-canned responses in the best prose that they can under deadline, and then trundle off to the next book. They don't, some of those critics, some of them, and fewer as the old guard dies off, some of those critics, I think, attacked this book with the fervor that they did because they couldn't be complacent about it. I myself think that's a cause for joy. I myself love being upset by a book, even having long-standing predispositions upset by a book. I love that, because while all of your predispositions are upset, while they're all twirling around up in the air instead of firmly anchored to the soil, you can learn something. Even if you don't want to, you can learn something. But then again, as a moltenly sexy 28-year-old, I am infamous for having a hard time understanding my older compatriots in the reviewing field. I don't understand why they don't like that feeling. I have no idea. Yes, it's unsettling, but it's ultimately to the good. But one way or another, that argument has, who knows how many people it is predisposed in one way or another around this book. And I would argue, for your Daily Penguin here, that you largely avoid the argument until after you know the book. Not just read the book. You want to read it a couple of times. You want to know it. Then you can acquaint yourself with the brouhaha. One way or another. On the plus side or the negative side, Mary McCarthy has written at least a couple of extremely eloquent defenses of the author and this book. And so have a bunch of other people. But Lord Almighty, once upon a time, in the late 1960s, early 1970s, you couldn't pick up an issue of the New York Review of Books without having at least 6,000 words devoted to this one book. And usually devoted to something that it never said. Not even in its original drafts. That can be a little maddening, and it can muddy the waters. If you're coming to this, it can stop you from seeing the most important thing, which is how brilliant this is. We shouldn't ever lose sight of that, right? This is absolutely brilliant. So my advice for the recommend section of your Penguin Classic would be read the book first. Even this Penguin Classic. This has an introduction. Well, now, could make it easy here. An introduction by Amos Elon. If I remember correctly, that introduction is fairly good. But even in this case, and in any other case, if you're coming to this book cold for the first time, don't read about it and don't read any introductions. Just read the book to start with. If you want a little preparation, if you feel like you'd be doing it a disservice to go in completely cold, then look up Eichmann on Wikipedia and just read that. I believe, I haven't looked it up myself, but I find it impossible to believe that the Wikipedia entry won't include a subsection on this book. Don't read that subsection. Don't inform yourself about the meta-controversy of the book. Instead, inform yourself of its raw material and then read it and know it. And if you do that, I think you'll be fascinated by the arguments that you can then read up on and outraged by them, and the scant justice that they often do to this book. But I also think you'll have found a new favorite author. And that's important. that's one would argue the most important thing. So your Penguin Classic today is entirely a recommend. Just like Black Lamb and Grey Falcon, not nearly as big, but still, just like Black Lamb and Grey Falcon, this is a classic of the 20th century, one of the great books of the century. Strongly recommended for you to read. And who knows what we'll encounter tomorrow. I don't think that any of the rest of Hannah Arendt is in the Penguin Classic line. I'm pretty sure this is the only book they make, so that's a shame. But I think it's probably true for Mary McCarthy as well. I'd be willing to bet that only The Group by Mary McCarthy is a Penguin Classic, if that. It might be that Mary McCarthy is not represented in Penguin Classics at all. We'll find out together, because if she is, she's bound to be in my collection, but not today. We'll go on tomorrow. I'm intentionally not planning these things ahead of time, so I have no idea who we'll encounter tomorrow. But I'll wrap this up for now with, again, a strong recommend, and I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.